Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
I stared at my phone screen reading the text message that would change everything between my family and me forever. Bart, you and Emma won't be coming to Thanksgiving this year. It's just easier without the tension. Hope you understand. Love, Mom. Below that, my brother Jake had added his own comment, 2 less plates to waste anyway. My hands shook as I typed back the response that would blow their entire world apart. You just voted out the person who's been paying your mortgage for the past 2 years, Jake? But I guess you forgot to mention that little detail to Mom. The silence after sending that message felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. I knew the chaos was coming, but for those few precious moments, I sat in my small apartment in Cedar Falls, Iowa, watching my 4-year-old daughter, Emma, build towers with her wooden blocks, completely oblivious to the family drama unfolding around her. Let me back up and explain how we got here. 18 months ago, my world imploded when my marriage to Sarah fell apart. The divorce was messy, expensive, and emotionally devastating. Sarah got the house in Des Moines. I got weekend custody of Emma, and I found myself starting over at 32 years old. The only silver lining was moving back to my hometown, where I could at least be closer to Emma during my custody weekends. My mother, Patricia, had always been complicated. She raised Jake and me as a single parent after Dad died when I was 12. And somewhere along the way, she decided that Jake was the golden child who could do no wrong. Jake was 3 years older, charming, outgoing, and had that natural ability to make people laugh. He became a real estate agent right after high school, married his college sweetheart Stephanie, and gave Mom her first grandchildren with twin boys who were now 8 years old. I took the harder path. Computer science degree years building my software consulting business, working long hours to establish myself in a competitive field. While Jake was getting praised for selling houses and producing grandchildren, I was building something sustainable but less immediately impressive to our small town community. The financial crisis that brought Jake to my door 2 years ago happened gradually, then all at once. The real estate market in our area had been declining, and Jake had made some risky investments in commercial properties that went bad. He was leveraged to the breaking point, drowning in credit card debt, facing foreclosure on the house where Stephanie and the boys lived. He came to me on a rainy Tuesday night in October, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Bart, I need help," he said, standing on my doorstep with tears in his eyes. "I'm going to lose everything." He explained the whole mess, the failed investments, the mounting bills, the mortgage payments he couldn't make. But here's the crucial part: he made me promise not to tell Mom or anyone else in the family. His pride couldn't handle the shame of admitting failure. So I became his anonymous savior. I contacted his bank, set up a shell company through my business, and arranged to make his mortgage payments directly. As far as Jake knew, some mysterious investor had taken pity on his situation and was helping him through tough times. He could tell people his business was recovering without technically lying. The arrangement cost me $3,800 every month, but I could afford it. My consulting business was thriving, especially after I landed several major contracts with companies transitioning to remote work during the pandemic. I wasn't doing it for recognition or gratitude. I was doing it because Jake was my brother, and I couldn't watch his family lose their home. But something ugly started happening over those 2 years. As Jake's immediate crisis passed and he stabilized his real estate business, he began taking credit for a miraculous turnaround. He spun stories about smart financial decisions and business savvy that pulled him back from the brink. Our mother ate it up, praising his resilience and business acumen at every family gathering. Meanwhile, my own struggles were dismissed or ignored. The emotional toll of my divorce, the challenge of single parenthood, the difficulty of rebuilding my life, none of that mattered compared to Jake's inspiring comeback story. When I brought Emma to family dinners, Mom would make pointed comments about my parenting choices, my living situation, my failure to provide Emma with a stable, two-parent household. The worst part was watching how they treated Emma. She was the sweetest, most observant little girl with curly brown hair and curious green eyes that missed nothing. But to Patricia and Jake, she represented my failures. She was evidence of my broken marriage, my inability to keep my family together. They were polite to her face, but dismissed her presence as an inconvenience. Last month, things escalated when I overheard Jake telling Patricia that family gatherings were more peaceful when Emma and I weren't there. He complained that my daughter was too energetic and that I was too sensitive about how people treated her. Patricia agreed, saying it might be better if we took a break from some family events. That's when I started recording conversations, not to be vindictive, but to document what was really happening. As a divorced father, I've learned to protect myself with evidence. I recorded Jake admitting that he found Emma annoying and wished we wouldn't come around so often. I recorded Patricia saying that Emma doesn't really fit in with the rest of the grandchildren because she's from a broken home. Which brings us to today's text message about Thanksgiving. After 2 years of quietly supporting Jake's family, after months of watching them emotionally exclude my daughter, after countless snide comments about my life choices, they decided to officially uninvite us from the family holiday. My phone started buzzing within minutes of sending that mortgage revelation. Patricia called first, her voice sharp with disbelief. "What are you talking about, Bart? What mortgage payments?" Before I could answer, Jake was calling on the other line. Text messages flooded in. "Please don't do this. You're going to ruin everything." I can explain. But I was done explaining. I was done being the family secret keeper, the invisible support system, the scapegoat for everyone else's problems. I had bank records, loan documents, recorded conversations, and 2 years' worth of canceled checks. The truth was about to come out, and there was no putting it back in the box. Emma looked up from her blocks and asked, "Daddy, why is your phone making so much noise?" I knelt down beside her, smoothing her hair. "Sometimes grown-ups have important conversations, sweetheart, but don't worry about it. We're going to have a wonderful Thanksgiving, just the two of us." She smiled and went back to building her tower, trusting completely that I would handle whatever was happening in the adult world. That trust gave me the strength to answer my mother's call and begin the conversation that would change our family forever. Patricia arrived at my apartment building 45 minutes after our phone call ended. I watched from my second-floor window as she climbed out of her blue Buick sedan, her face set in the determined expression I remembered from childhood lectures. She moved with purpose across the parking lot, her gray hair pulled back in its usual bun, wearing the navy cardigan she reserved for serious occasions. Emma was having her afternoon snack at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my mother standing rigid in the hallway, clutching her purse with white knuckles. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the living room. "And you need to explain what you meant about Jake's mortgage." I settled Emma in her bedroom with coloring books and closed the door before returning to face Patricia. She had positioned herself on the edge of my couch, back straight, ready for battle. "I don't believe Jake would lie to me about his finances," she began. "He tells me everything important." That's when I pulled out the folder I'd been preparing for months, knowing this day would eventually come. Bank statements, loan modification documents, copies of every electronic transfer I'd made to Jake's mortgage company. I spread them across my coffee table like laying out cards for a poker hand. Patricia's face went through several stages as she examined the evidence. First confusion, then denial, then something that looked like physical pain as the reality settled in. "These numbers? You've been paying $3,800 every month for 2 years." I nodded. $91,200 total, not counting the fees and interest adjustments. She picked up one of the bank statements with trembling hands. "But Jake said he turned his business around. He said he made smart investments that saved everything. Jake was 3 weeks away from foreclosure when he came to me, I explained. He was crying in my living room, begging me not to tell you because he couldn't handle the shame of admitting failure. I set up the payments through my consulting business so he could save face. Patricia set down the document and stared at the wall above my head. 2 years, she whispered. He's been lying for 2 years. Before I could respond, aggressive knocking echoed through the apartment. I opened the door to find Jake standing in the hallway with Stephanie and their 8-year-old twin boys, Tyler and Trevor. Jake's face was flushed red, his hair disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it during the drive over. "Mom, don't listen to whatever he's telling you," Jake said, pushing into the room. "Bart is trying to make me look bad because he's jealous that his life fell apart and mine didn't." Stephanie hung back in the doorway with the boys, her expression uncertain. She was a petite woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, usually impeccably put together, but today she looked exhausted and worried. The twins seemed confused by the tension in the room, pressing closer to their mother. I gestured toward the coffee table covered with financial documents. "The evidence speaks for itself, Jake. Want to explain to Mom and Stephanie how you miraculously recovered from near bankruptcy without any outside help?" Jake's confidence cracked slightly as he saw the bank statement spread across the table. "Okay, fine, you helped me out when things got rough. I was planning to pay you back once business picked up again. I just forgot to mention it because it wasn't a big deal." $91,000 isn't a big deal. Patricia's voice had gone cold. "You've been letting me praise your business recovery for 2 years, knowing your brother was paying your mortgage." "It's more complicated than that," Jake said, but his explanation sounded weak even to himself. He turned to Stephanie. "Honey, you know how hard I've been working to rebuild everything." Stephanie's face had gone pale as she processed the financial revelations. "Jake, are you telling me we've been living in a house that Bart has been paying for? That your recovery story was a lie?" Emma's bedroom door opened, and she wandered into the living room, drawn by the raised voices. She looked around at all the adults with her perceptive green eyes and asked, "Why is everyone upset? And why is Uncle Jake's face all red?" The innocent question cut through the adult drama like a knife. Here was a 4-year-old child, pure and direct, asking exactly what everyone was thinking, but too caught up in complicated emotions to address directly. Patricia looked down at Emma, and I saw something shift in her expression. Maybe it was seeing her granddaughter witness this family chaos, or maybe it was realizing how Emma had been excluded from family gatherings while Jake's financial lies were celebrated. "Uncle Jake is just having a difficult conversation," I told Emma. "Why don't you show Tyler and Trevor your new puzzle?" But as Emma approached her cousins, I noticed Tyler whisper something to Trevor, and they both stepped backward closer to their mother. Even the 8-year-old boys had absorbed the family's attitude toward Emma, treating her like she didn't quite belong. That's when I pulled out my phone and played the recording I'd made 3 weeks earlier. Jake's voice filled the room clear and unmistakable. "I just think family dinners are more relaxing when it's just us. You know, Emma is sweet, but she's a lot of work and Bart gets defensive about everything. Maybe it would be better if they took a break from some of the gatherings." Patricia's voice responded on the recording. "You're probably right. Emma doesn't really fit in with Tyler and Trevor anyway. Different upbringing, different family situation. It's easier when everyone comes from stable homes." The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie's eyes filled with tears as she realized her children had been included in conversations that actively excluded their 4-year-old cousin. Patricia stared at the phone like it was a snake that had bitten her. Jake's face went through multiple expressions before settling on rage. "You recorded us? You've been secretly recording family conversations?" "I documented what I needed to document," I said calmly. "As a divorced father, I've learned to protect myself and my daughter with evidence. And it's a good thing I did because now everyone knows exactly how you really feel about Emma." Emma had gone very quiet, standing in the middle of the room, holding her puzzle box, sensing that something important was happening, but not understanding what. The adults were all looking at her with different expressions. Patricia with growing shame, Jake with uncomfortable guilt, Stephanie with protective sympathy. Tyler, the more outspoken of the twins, looked confused. "Mom, why can't Emma come to Thanksgiving? She's nice." That simple question from an 8-year-old boy shattered whatever composure Jake had left. Because everything is complicated, and grown-ups have complicated problems, and kids don't understand, he snapped. Trevor started crying, overwhelmed by his father's raised voice and the general tension. Stephanie immediately knelt down to comfort him while giving Jake a look that could have frozen water. "Jake, that's enough," Patricia said quietly. "We need to figure this out without yelling at children." But the damage was expanding beyond just our immediate family conflict. Emma had heard herself discussed on that recording, had seen the adult reactions to learning how she'd been talked about behind her back, had witnessed her uncle's angry outburst directed at her cousins. She walked over to me and tugged on my sleeve. When I knelt down, she whispered in my ear, "Daddy, do they not want me at Thanksgiving because I don't have a mommy who lives with us?" That whispered question, delivered with 4-year-old logic and heartbreaking directness, was the moment I realized this wasn't just about Jake's financial lies or Patricia's favoritism. This was about my daughter learning to see herself as unwanted and different, absorbing messages about her worth based on family politics she couldn't possibly understand. I picked Emma up and held her close. "You are wanted and loved, sweetheart. Some grown-ups just forget how to act kindly toward each other. But that's not your fault." Looking over Emma's head at the adults in my living room, I made a decision that would change everything. "I think it's time everyone left," I said. "We all need to process what happened here today." But as Jake and his family gathered themselves to leave, Stephanie lingered behind. She approached me while Jake was helping the twins with their coats, her voice low and urgent. "Bart, I had no idea about the mortgage payments. Jake told me he turned things around with smart investments and hard work. If he's been lying about the finances, what else has he been lying about?" Before I could answer, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "That's my sister's phone number in Oregon. If things get worse, call me. Emma doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this." Then they were gone, leaving Patricia and me to face each other across a coffee table, covered with evidence of her favorite son's deception and my own hidden generosity. Patricia slowly gathered the bank statements and loan documents, studying each one like she was trying to memorize the numbers. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "How long have you known that I favored Jake over you?" The question was so direct and vulnerable that it caught me off guard. "Pretty much my whole life," I admitted. "But I thought if I just worked harder, achieved more, proved myself, eventually you'd see my worth too." She nodded slowly, still clutching the financial documents. "And instead, I praised him for a recovery that you made possible while criticizing you for struggles that were completely understandable." We sat in silence while Emma played quietly in her room, both of us realizing that the Thanksgiving text message had pulled a thread that was unraveling decades of family dysfunction. The phone call from my Uncle Dennis came at 6:30 that evening, just as Emma and I were finishing dinner. Dennis was Patricia's younger brother, a steady man who worked as a high school principal in the next county over. His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to understand a complex situation. "Bart, your mother called me about an hour ago. She was pretty shaken up. Something about mortgage payments and family arguments. I'm having trouble following the whole story." I gave Dennis the abbreviated version while Emma watched cartoons on my laptop, her plate of chicken nuggets forgotten, as she got absorbed in animated characters solving problems with friendship and teamwork. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dennis listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or disappointment. When I finished explaining the financial arrangement and the Thanksgiving exclusion, he was quiet for a long moment. You know, Bart, Carol, and I have always wondered why you seemed so distant from your mother and Jake. At family reunions, you'd show up, be polite, but there was always this tension we couldn't identify. My Aunt Carol was Dennis's wife, a warm woman who taught kindergarten and had always been kind to me during extended family gatherings. Unlike Patricia, Carol had consistently shown interest in my life and achievements, asking about my business and praising my dedication to Emma. Carol noticed how differently Patricia treated you compared to Jake, Dennis continued. She mentioned it several times over the years, but we figured it wasn't our place to interfere in how Patricia managed her relationship with her sons. This revelation surprised me. I'd assumed the extended family saw the same dynamic. Patricia promoted Jake as the successful, stable son, me as the divorced disappointment who couldn't keep his life together. The thing is, Dennis said, Carol and I both wondered about Jake's sudden financial recovery a couple years ago. His business was struggling. He was clearly stressed about money. Then suddenly everything was fine, and he was talking about smart investments. It didn't quite add up. While I was processing this, my phone buzzed with text messages. Jake was apparently reaching out to various family members trying to control the narrative before word spread too far. He'd sent messages to our cousins, Patricia's sister Margaret, who lived in Minnesota, and several family friends. Jake's version of events, from what I could gather from the forwarded messages Dennis read to me, was that I was holding financial help over his head and trying to destroy the family because I was bitter about my divorce and jealous of his stable marriage. The manipulation is pretty sophisticated, Dennis observed. He's painting himself as the victim and you as the unstable one. But here's the problem with that strategy. Margaret has been keeping track of family dynamics for years. She's got a good memory for details and inconsistencies. Margaret was Patricia's older sister, a retired accountant, who lived in Minneapolis with her husband Robert. She was sharp, observant, and had never been impressed by Jake's charm offensive. At family gatherings, I'd noticed Margaret watching Jake with skeptical eyes when he told his business success stories. That night after Emma was in bed, Margaret called me directly. Her voice was crisp and businesslike, the tone of someone who'd spent decades analyzing financial documents and catching discrepancies. Bart, I just got off the phone with Jake and his story doesn't hold water. He's claiming you offered to help with his mortgage as a gift, then changed your mind and started demanding recognition. But that doesn't match the Jake I know. Margaret had been quietly observing our family dynamics for years, she explained. She'd noticed Patricia's favoritism, Jake's tendency to exaggerate his achievements, and my pattern of working hard without seeking credit or attention. 2 years ago, Jake was clearly in financial trouble. I could see it in his body language, his clothes, the way he talked about business. Then suddenly he's driving a newer car and talking about successful investments. I wondered where the turnaround money came from. She paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. I've been keeping notes about family interactions for years. Not to be nosy, but because I'm concerned about patterns of favoritism affecting the next generation. Tyler and Trevor are picking up signals about Emma being somehow lesser or different. This observation hit me hard because I'd noticed the same thing. At family gatherings, the twins would play with each other but rarely include Emma in their games. They'd absorbed the adult attitude that she didn't quite belong, that her presence was somewhat problematic. Margaret had more disturbing news. Jake's response to being exposed wasn't remorse or gratitude toward me. Instead, he'd spent the afternoon calling family members and business associates, trying to frame the situation as my attempt to manipulate and embarrass him. He called your cousin Beth in Chicago, Margaret reported. Told her you'd been secretly recording family conversations and were now threatening to ruin his business reputation unless he publicly thanked you for mortgage payments he never asked for. The distortion was breathtaking. Jake was taking the basic facts and twisting them into a story where I was the villain, he was the victim, and my documentation of abusive behavior was reframed as stalking and manipulation. But Jake's reputation management strategy had a critical flaw. Several family members had witnessed his financial struggles firsthand, and his sudden recovery story had never quite made sense to the more observant relatives. Margaret had been doing her own investigation since Patricia's phone call. She'd contacted Jake's business partner, a man named Craig, who'd been worried about Jake's financial stability affecting their real estate partnership. Craig told me something interesting, Margaret said. About 18 months ago, Jake suddenly became much more confident about taking on larger property investments. He started talking about having backup financial resources and connections with private investors who could help if deals went bad. This was news to me. I'd been paying Jake's mortgage to prevent foreclosure, but apparently he'd been using the financial stability my payments provided to take bigger business risks, knowing he had a safety net. Craig was relieved that Jake had found financial backing, Margaret continued, but he always wondered who the mysterious investor was. Jake was very secretive about it, claimed the investor wanted to remain anonymous for tax reasons. So while I thought I was helping Jake maintain his family home during a temporary crisis, he'd been leveraging my support to expand his business operations. The mortgage payments I viewed as emergency assistance, he'd been treating as venture capital backing. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Stephanie had left Jake. The phone call came from my cousin Beth, who'd gotten the information from a neighbor of Jake's, who'd seen Stephanie loading suitcases into her car at sunrise. The twins weren't with her. Apparently, she'd taken them to school normally, then returned home to pack while Jake was at a business meeting. According to the neighbor, Beth reported, Stephanie seemed very calm and organized, like she'd been planning this move for a while. She took several boxes of papers and documents along with the clothes and personal items. This development sent Jake into panic mode. He called me directly for the first time since the confrontation, his voice shaky and desperate. Bart, you have to help me fix this. Stephanie thinks I've been lying to her about everything. She's talking about taking the boys to Oregon where her sister lives. This whole thing is spinning out of control. The irony was staggering. Jake wanted my help to clean up the mess created by revealing that he'd already been accepting my help for 2 years. He still didn't understand that the problem wasn't the financial assistance itself, but his decision to lie about it, while allowing our family to exclude Emma and criticize my life choices. What exactly do you want me to do? I asked. Tell Stephanie that the mortgage thing was just a misunderstanding. Tell her I was planning to pay you back and just forgot to mention it. Help me convince her that I wasn't really lying, just not communicating clearly. I sat in my kitchen watching Emma eat her cereal and hum along to a children's song on the radio, and realized that Jake still didn't grasp the fundamental issue. He wanted me to help him continue the deception that had caused all this damage in the first place. Jake, the problem isn't that you accepted help. The problem is that you built a false narrative around that help. Let Mom praise you for a recovery I made possible and participated in excluding my daughter from family gatherings because you found us inconvenient. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Jake's voice, smaller and more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. I never meant for it to go this far. I couldn't handle admitting failure to Mom. You know how she is. She's always expected me to be the successful one. For the first time in our entire conversation, Jake was acknowledging the family dynamic that had shaped both our lives. Patricia's expectation that he would be the golden child had created pressure that led to lies, which led to deeper lies, which led to a web of deception that trapped everyone. But before I could respond with anything approaching understanding or forgiveness, Jake's tone shifted back to manipulation. Look, if you really want to help Emma have a relationship with her grandmother and cousins, you'll help me fix this situation with Stephanie. Because if my marriage falls apart, the whole family is going to blame you for destroying everything. That threat crystallized something for me. Jake wasn't calling to apologize or take responsibility. He was calling to recruit me as an accomplice in perpetuating the same lies that had created this crisis. Even faced with losing his wife and children, his instinct was to manipulate rather than to honestly confront his choices. I hung up the phone and looked at Emma, who was creating patterns with her cereal pieces while singing softly to herself. She was completely absorbed in her small creative project, unaware of the adult drama swirling around her, trusting that I would handle whatever needed handling in the grown-up world. That trust, that innocent confidence that I would protect her and provide stability, reminded me why I'd started documenting family conversations in the first place. Emma deserved relationships with relatives who valued her for who she was, not people who tolerated her presence as a favor to me. The phone rang again, but this time the caller ID showed Margaret's number. When I answered, her voice was brisk and determined. "Bart, I've been making some calls, and I think you need to know what I've discovered. This situation is bigger than just mortgage payments and Thanksgiving invitations. There are patterns here that go back decades, and it's time someone connected the dots." Margaret's call came with revelations that reframed everything I thought I understood about my family's dynamics. She'd spent the previous evening making phone calls to relatives, family friends, and longtime neighbors, piecing together a timeline of Patricia's favoritism and Jake's manipulative behavior that stretched back to our childhood. "I called your father's sister Helen in Wisconsin," Margaret began. Helen was my aunt on my father's side, a woman who'd maintained cordial but distant relationships with Patricia after my father died. Helen remembers things differently than the stories Patricia has been telling for years. According to Helen, the narrative that Patricia had struggled as a single mother, was a sinceritos who did her best to raise two difficult boys, wasn't accurate. Helen remembered Patricia actively discouraging my achievements while celebrating Jake's mediocre efforts. When I won academic awards in high school, Patricia would downplay them as showing off. When Jake barely graduated, Patricia threw a big celebration for his perseverance. Helen also remembered something troubling, Margaret continued. "When you got accepted to college, with a partial academic scholarship, Patricia told people you were abandoning the family by going away to school. But when Jake decided not to pursue college at all, she praised his practical approach to life. This pattern had continued into our adult lives. My business success was dismissed as computer stuff that doesn't really help people, while Jake's real estate career was celebrated as providing homes for families. When I got married, Patricia found fault with Sarah and predicted the marriage would fail. When Jake married Stephanie, Patricia called it a perfect match and immediately started planning for grandchildren. The more disturbing revelations involved Emma specifically. Margaret had spoken with several relatives about their observations of family gatherings over the past 2 years, and a clear pattern emerged of Emma being subtly excluded and marginalized. "Your cousin Beth noticed that Patricia would take photos of Tyler and Trevor together, but rarely included Emma in the family pictures," Margaret reported. And Carol mentioned that Patricia often referred to Jake's children when talking about grandchildren as if Emma didn't quite count in the same category. While Margaret was conducting her family investigation, I was dealing with a crisis in my professional life. My ex-wife Sarah had called that morning, her voice tight with concern and anger. "Emma came home from your place yesterday talking about Uncle Jake maybe losing his house, and adults yelling and making recordings." Sarah said, "What exactly is going on over there? Are you involving our daughter in some kind of family financial drama?" This was my worst nightmare, Emma's exposure to family conflict being used against me in custody discussions. Sarah had been looking for reasons to modify our custody arrangement, claiming that my emotional state since the divorce made me an unstable influence on Emma. "I'm trying to protect Emma from a toxic family situation," I explained. "I've been documenting how my mother and brother have been excluding her from family gatherings and making her feel unwanted." But Sarah wasn't interested in the nuances of family dysfunction. "I don't care about your issues with your family, Bart. I care about Emma being exposed to adult conflicts and financial manipulation. If you can't maintain appropriate boundaries, I'll have to reconsider the custody schedule." The threat was clear: if my family drama continued affecting Emma, Sarah would use it against me legally. I'd have to choose between protecting Emma from my family's toxicity and potentially losing time with her altogether. Meanwhile, the situation at Jake's house was deteriorating rapidly. Stephanie had indeed packed up and left, taking important financial documents with her. According to neighbors who'd spoken to Margaret's network of contacts, Jake had been frantically calling Stephanie all morning, but she wasn't responding. The real bombshell came when Margaret called back that afternoon with information from an unexpected source, Jake's business partner, Craig. Craig is worried about the partnership's reputation, Margaret reported. Apparently, Jake has been telling clients and other real estate agents that he recovered from financial difficulties through smart investments and private backing. Some of his recent deals have been based on his claimed financial stability. This revelation was staggering. Jake hadn't just been lying to our family about his recovery. He'd been misrepresenting his financial situation to business clients and professional contacts. The mortgage payments I'd been making in secret were being used as evidence of Jake's business acumen and financial resourcefulness. Craig is concerned that if the truth comes out about Jake's actual financial situation, their business partnership could be damaged, Margaret continued. Apparently, several clients chose to work with Jake specifically because they believed his comeback story demonstrated exceptional financial judgment. But the most shocking discovery came from Margaret's conversation with our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived next door to Patricia for 15 years and had observed our family dynamics from a unique perspective. Mrs. Patterson remembered the period 2 years ago when Jake's financial crisis was developing. She'd seen him arguing with Stephanie in their driveway multiple times, noticed that their lawn care and home maintenance had declined, observed that they'd stopped hosting barbecues and social events. Mrs. Patterson also remembered when things suddenly improved for Jake's family, Margaret said. New landscaping, fresh paint on the house, Stephanie started shopping at the upscale grocery store again. Mrs. Patterson assumed Jake had gotten a promotion or landed a big sale. The timeline Mrs. Patterson described matched perfectly with when I'd started making mortgage payments, providing independent confirmation of the cause and effect relationship that Jake was trying to deny. But Mrs. Patterson had noticed something else during this period, the change in how Emma was treated at family gatherings held at Patricia's house. According to Mrs. Patterson, Emma used to run freely between Patricia's house and the neighbor's yard during family barbecues. She was included in games with Tyler and Trevor, invited to help with cooking projects, treated like any other grandchild. But over the past year or so, Mrs. Patterson noticed Emma staying closer to you, seeming more hesitant about joining family activities. This observation cut deep because I'd noticed the same shift, but hadn't fully understood its significance. Emma had become more clingy at family gatherings, less willing to venture away from me to play with her cousins or help her grandmother with projects. I'd attributed it to normal childhood phases, but Mrs. Patterson's outside perspective suggested Emma was responding to subtle changes in how she was being treated. The most damaging revelation came that evening when Margaret called with news from Jake's business world. She'd spoken with a client of Jake's, a woman named Linda, who'd been considering listing her house with Jake's real estate agency. Linda told me something very troubling, Margaret said. Last month, Jake was trying to convince her to use his services by talking about how he'd overcome major financial setbacks through smart decision-making. He specifically mentioned learning to cut out family members who were holding him back as part of his business recovery strategy. The implication was clear. Jake had been portraying his emotional distancing from Emma and me as a positive business decision, a strategic choice to focus on success rather than being dragged down by problematic family relationships. This revelation made me physically sick. While I'd been quietly supporting his family financially, Jake had been using our exclusion from family events as evidence of his business wisdom to potential clients. But Margaret had saved the most important information for last. She'd been in contact with Patricia's doctor after Patricia mentioned experiencing chest pains and difficulty sleeping since our confrontation. The stress is affecting Patricia's health, Margaret said. Her doctor is concerned about her blood pressure and wants her to avoid emotional upheaval. But here's what's interesting. Patricia told her doctor that she's been discovering disturbing patterns in her family relationships and feels like she needs to make amends for years of mistakes. This suggested that Patricia was experiencing genuine remorse rather than just defensive anger about being confronted with Jake's lies. The possibility that my mother might actually recognize and acknowledge her favoritism was something I'd never seriously considered. Margaret's final piece of information came from an unexpected source, Walter, Patricia's father, and my grandfather, who'd been living in a retirement community in Arizona since my grandmother died 3 years ago. "I called your grandfather to give him a heads up about the family situation," Margaret said, "but it turns out he's been aware of problems for years. He's been quietly observing how different family members treat each other during his visits and phone calls." Grandpa Walter, now 84 years old, had apparently been documenting his own concerns about Patricia's favoritism and Jake's character. As Margaret described it, Walter had been considering changes to his estate planning based on what he'd observed about his children and grandchildren's integrity and treatment of each other. "Your grandfather wants to fly out from Arizona to address this situation directly," Margaret said. "He's tired of watching Patricia damage her relationship with you and Emma, while enabling Jake's irresponsible behavior. The thought of my grandfather getting involved was both relieving and terrifying." Walter was a retired engineer, a logical man who valued integrity and hard work. He'd always been kind to me, but hadn't interfered in Patricia's parenting decisions. If he was ready to intervene now, it meant he viewed the current situation as seriously damaging to the family's long-term well-being. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she asked the question that had been weighing on my mind all day. "Daddy, are we still going to have Thanksgiving?" I smoothed her hair and kissed her forehead. "We're going to have a wonderful Thanksgiving, sweetheart. It might be different than we originally planned, but we'll make it special." She nodded sleepily, satisfied with the promise, but not needing details about the adult complexities that were reshaping our family dynamics. Looking at my daughter's peaceful face, I realized that Margaret's investigation had given me something invaluable perspective. For years, I'd questioned whether my perceptions of favoritism and exclusion were accurate or if I was being overly sensitive. Now I had confirmation from multiple outside observers that the patterns I'd experienced were real and had been noticed by others. But more importantly, I had evidence that Emma's exclusion wasn't subtle or accidental. It was part of a deliberate narrative that positioned her as somehow problematic or less worthy than her cousins. That realization strengthened my resolve to protect her from further emotional damage, regardless of the cost to my relationships with Patricia and Jake. The next phase of this family crisis was about to begin, and I was finally ready to face it with clarity about what I was protecting and why it mattered. "My mom texted you and your 4-year-old won't be coming to Thanksgiving. It's..." 3 days before Thanksgiving, Margaret called with a plan that would force our family to confront decades of dysfunction in one concentrated conversation. She'd arranged what she called an intervention, though it felt more like a reckoning that had been building for years. "I've contacted everyone who needs to be part of this discussion," Margaret announced. "Patricia, Jake, Stephanie, if she's willing to participate, and you. We're meeting at my hotel conference room tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I flew in this morning specifically to facilitate this conversation." Margaret had driven down from Minneapolis and booked a suite at the Hampton Inn near downtown Cedar Falls. She'd chosen a neutral location away from anyone's home, eliminating the emotional baggage and power dynamics associated with familiar spaces. "I've spent the past week investigating not just this current crisis, but patterns of family behavior going back 20 years, Margaret continued. "I have documentation, witness statements, and timeline analysis that puts this mortgage situation in proper context." The prospect of facing Jake and Patricia in a structured confrontation filled me with anxiety, but also relief. For years, family conflicts had been managed through whispered conversations, subtle manipulations, and emotional avoidance. Margaret's intervention would force everyone to address the real issues directly. I arranged for Emma to spend the afternoon with my neighbor Carol, a retired teacher who occasionally helped with childcare. Carol had become a trusted friend over the past year, and Emma loved playing with Carol's collection of puzzles and educational games. "Is this about the grown-up conversation problem?" Emma asked as I helped her put on her jacket. Her perceptive question reminded me how much she'd absorbed from witnessing the family tensions. 4-year-olds are incredibly sensitive to emotional undercurrents, even when they can't understand the specific issues causing adult stress. "Yes, sweetheart. Some grown-ups in our family need to have an important talk about how to treat each other better. But you don't need to worry about it. Carol has some new puzzles she wants to show you." Margaret's hotel conference room was set up like a business meeting, with a rectangular table, notepads, and water glasses at each place. She'd positioned herself at the head of the table with file folders and documents organized in front of her. The formal setting immediately established that this wasn't going to be an emotional family argument, but a structured examination of facts and patterns. Patricia arrived first looking older and more fragile than I'd seen her in years. She'd lost weight since our confrontation 3 days earlier, and her usually perfect appearance seemed diminished. She sat across from me, without making eye contact, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jake entered 10 minutes later, his confident swagger replaced by nervous energy. He'd dressed professionally, as if this were a business meeting rather than a family discussion, but his clothes couldn't hide the strain in his face or the dark circles under his eyes. "Stephanie won't be joining us," Jake announced as he took his seat. "She's staying with her sister in Portland and doesn't want to participate in family discussions until she's had time to process everything." Margaret nodded and opened her first folder. "That's understandable. Stephanie needs space to evaluate how Jake's financial deception affects her marriage and her children's future. But her absence doesn't change what we need to address here." Margaret had prepared her intervention with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant investigating fraud. She'd created a timeline spanning 25 years, documenting instances of Patricia's favoritism toward Jake and corresponding dismissal of my achievements. She'd gathered witness statements from relatives who'd observed family dynamics. Most damaging, she'd compiled evidence of how this favoritism had extended to the treatment of grandchildren. "Let's start with the immediate crisis," Margaret said, sliding copies of bank statements across the table. "Bart has been paying Jake's mortgage for 24 months, totaling $91,200. During this same period, Patricia has been praising Jake's business recovery while criticizing Bart's life choices." Patricia winced as she examined the financial documents. "I had no idea Bart was helping Jake financially. If I'd known, I would have acknowledged his generosity." "But that's exactly the problem," Margaret responded. "You didn't know because Jake deliberately concealed the help while taking credit for the results. And during this same period, you've been systematically excluding Bart and Emma from family gatherings." Margaret pulled out her second folder containing printed emails, text message screenshots, and handwritten notes documenting the pattern of exclusion. She'd been more thorough than I'd realized, collecting evidence from multiple family members who'd witnessed the gradual marginalization of Emma and me. "Here's a text message from Patricia to Jake 6 months ago." Margaret read aloud, quote, "Maybe we should start having smaller family dinners. Emma gets overstimulated and Bart gets defensive. It's more peaceful when it's just us." Unquote. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We never meant to exclude them permanently. We just thought some gatherings would be easier with fewer people." "Easier for whom?" Margaret asked pointedly. "Because according to multiple witnesses, Emma used to be included in family photos, invited to cooking projects, and welcomed at holiday gatherings. Over the past 2 years, she's been progressively marginalized while Tyler and Trevor remained central to family activities." Margaret's most damaging evidence involved Jake's business networking, where he'd been using our family estrangement as evidence of his professional focus and business wisdom. Jake told potential clients that part of his financial recovery involved eliminating family drama and focusing on success rather than problem relationships. Margaret read from her notes. He specifically described distancing himself from family members who couldn't handle his success as a strategic business decision. Patricia looked genuinely shocked. Jake, did you really tell people that your financial recovery involved cutting off your brother and his daughter? Jake's face flushed red. It wasn't like that. I was just explaining how I learned to focus on positive relationships instead of getting dragged down by people who... He stopped mid-sentence, realizing that finishing the thought would only make things worse. People who what? I asked quietly. Jake couldn't meet my eyes. People who were going through difficult times and needed a lot of emotional support. The statement hung in the air like toxic gas. Jake had just admitted that he viewed my divorce recovery and single parenting struggles as burdens to be avoided, rather than challenges where a brother might offer support. Margaret wasn't finished with her documentation. She discovered that Jake's lies extended beyond our family into his marriage and business partnerships. Stephanie had left not just because of the mortgage deception, but because she'd realized Jake had been misrepresenting their financial situation in multiple contexts. According to Stephanie's sister, Jake told Stephanie that he'd received a business loan from a private investor to help with the mortgage situation. Margaret reported. Stephanie believed they were paying back a legitimate business debt, not receiving ongoing family assistance. This revelation meant Jake had been lying to everyone, simultaneously telling our family that his business recovery was independent and successful, telling his wife that he'd secured legitimate business funding, telling his business partners that he had private investor backing, and telling potential clients that his financial stability demonstrated superior business judgment. Patricia absorbed this information with growing horror. So while Bart was quietly supporting your family, you were building your entire public identity around lies about that support. Jake's defensive armor finally cracked completely. I was ashamed, okay. I couldn't handle admitting failure to anyone. Dad always said I'd be successful, and when everything fell apart, I couldn't face disappointing everyone who believed in me. For the first time in our adult relationship, Jake was acknowledging the pressure created by being Patricia's favorite son. The golden child expectations had created a prison of perfectionism that made honest failure feel impossible. But Margaret wasn't letting anyone off the hook with psychological explanations. She'd brought us here to confront behavior and its consequences, not just to understand motivations. The shame explanation doesn't justify treating Emma like a problematic family member, Margaret said firmly. A 4-year-old child has been absorbing messages that she's somehow less worthy than her cousins because her father went through a divorce. Margaret's final folder contained the most surprising information documentation of similar family patterns from previous generations. She'd researched Patricia's own childhood and discovered that Patricia had been the unfavored daughter in her family, constantly compared to her sister, and found lacking. Patricia, your mother consistently favored me over you, Margaret said gently. You were the responsible daughter who helped with household tasks, while I was the social butterfly who got attention for being charming. You experienced exactly what you've been putting Bart through with Jake. This historical perspective reframed everything. Patricia's favoritism toward Jake wasn't just random preference, it was the reproduction of family patterns that had damaged her own childhood. She was unconsciously repeating the emotional dynamics that had made her feel inadequate and unworthy. Patricia began crying, 25 years of buried emotions finally surfacing. I swore I'd never play favorites with my children. I thought I was being fair. But you weren't being fair, I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. And now Emma is experiencing the same rejection you felt as a child. The room fell silent except for Patricia's quiet crying. Margaret allowed the emotional moment to settle before introducing her most important piece of information. There's someone else who's been watching these family dynamics and drawing conclusions, Margaret announced. Your father has been observing how his children and grandchildren treat each other, and he's decided to intervene directly. Before anyone could ask what she meant, there was a knock on the conference room door. Margaret opened it to reveal my grandfather Walter, 84 years old, but still carrying himself with the dignity and authority that had made him a successful engineer and respected community member. Walter walked into the room slowly using his cane for balance and surveyed the three of us sitting around the conference table. His presence immediately changed the emotional atmosphere. This was the family patriarch, the man whose opinion carried weight with everyone present. I flew out from Arizona yesterday, Walter announced, settling himself into the chair Margaret had prepared for him. I decided it was time to stop watching my family destroy itself through lies, favoritism, and selfishness. Walter had brought his own folder estate planning documents that would redistribute his inheritance based on the character and behavior he'd observed over the past 5 years. I've been documenting how each of you treat family members, especially the children, Walter said, opening his folder to reveal handwritten notes and typed observations. Bart, you've consistently put Emma's well-being first, even when it cost you financially and emotionally. Jake, you've consistently put your own image and comfort first, even when it hurt other family members. Patricia, you've consistently enabled Jake's selfishness while punishing Bart's integrity. The implications for inheritance were clear, but Walter's deeper message was about values and family legacy. He wasn't just redistributing money. He was making a statement about which family members embodied the character traits he wanted to reward and continue into future generations. Emma is my great-granddaughter, Walter said, looking directly at Patricia and Jake. She deserves to grow up knowing she's valued and welcomed by her family. If you can't provide that environment, then I'll ensure she has other resources and relationships to support her development. The intervention had accomplished what Margaret intended, forcing everyone to confront the real issues without the emotional manipulation and avoidance that usually characterized our family conflicts. But as we sat in that hotel conference room with Walter's estate planning documents spread across the table and Patricia's tears slowly ending, I realized we'd reached the moment where everyone had to choose what kind of family we wanted to be going forward. The old patterns were finally visible to everyone involved. The question now was whether we could build something better from this foundation of painful honesty. Walter's presence in that conference room shifted everything. At 84, my grandfather carried the authority of someone who'd lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and decades of family celebrations and crises. When he spoke, 3 generations listened with the respect reserved for elders who'd earned their wisdom through experience. I've been thinking about this situation for 72 hours straight. Walter began settling his weathered hands on the conference table. And I keep coming back to one question: what kind of family legacy are we creating for Emma and the boys? He'd brought more than just inheritance documents. Walter had prepared a comprehensive analysis of our family's financial and emotional dynamics, approaching the crisis with the same methodical thinking he'd applied to engineering problems throughout his career. Jake, I need you to understand something important. Walter said, his voice gentle but firm. I helped pay for your father's funeral when Patricia couldn't afford it. I've been contributing to your mother's household expenses for 15 years. I've been watching how family members support each other through difficult times, and I've been keeping track of who gives help and who just receives it. This revelation surprised everyone at the table. Walter had been quietly observing and financially supporting our family for years, without seeking recognition or gratitude. His perspective on Jake's mortgage crisis, and my response, carried the weight of someone who understood both generosity and accountability. Bart's mortgage payments to help your family weren't unusual or exceptional, Walter continued. They were exactly what family members should do for each other during temporary crises. The unusual part was your decision to lie about the help while allowing your mother to exclude the person who was helping you. Jake had been quiet through most of Margaret's intervention, but Walter's direct challenge broke through his remaining defenses. Grandpa, I was scared and ashamed. I didn't know how to admit that everything had fallen apart. Being scared and ashamed is understandable, Walter replied. What's unacceptable is building your recovery on lies while letting innocent people pay the emotional cost of your deception. Walter turned to Patricia with the patient expression of a father who still loved his daughter, but was deeply disappointed in her choices. Patricia, I need to ask you directly, do you understand how your favoritism toward Jake has affected Bart and Emma? Patricia wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. I'm starting to see it. But I thought I was just supporting Jake through difficult times, not punishing Bart for his problems. But you were punishing him, Walter said firmly. You praised Jake for a financial recovery that Bart made possible while criticizing Bart for divorce struggles that were completely normal and understandable. You made Emma feel unwelcome at family gatherings while celebrating Tyler and Trevor's presence. Walter pulled out a handwritten letter and placed it in the center of the table. I wrote this last night in my hotel room. It's a letter to Emma explaining what I've learned about how she's been treated by her family and what I think she deserves to know about her worth and her future. The thought of my grandfather writing a letter to my 4-year-old daughter, documenting the family dysfunction she'd been exposed to, was both heartbreaking and deeply touching. Walter was creating a record for Emma to understand when she was old enough that at least one family member had recognized her value and fought for her dignity. I'm not going to read the letter aloud, Walter said, but I want everyone here to know that Emma will grow up understanding that her family's treatment of her was wrong and that she has resources and support that don't depend on other people's approval or acceptance. The inheritance implications were becoming clear. Walter was restructuring his estate to support Emma's future, directly removing the possibility that Patricia's favoritism or Jake's selfishness could affect my daughter's opportunities or security. But Walter had more immediate concerns than estate planning. He'd discovered that Jake's deception had created legal and financial risks that extended beyond our family drama. Did Jake, I spoke with your business partner Craig yesterday evening, Walter announced. He's concerned that your misrepresentation of your financial situation to clients could expose the partnership to fraud allegations. This was news to everyone, including Jake. Craig apparently had been doing his own investigation into Jake's claims about private investor backing and smart financial recovery. Several clients had made business decisions based on Jake's implied financial stability and business judgment. Craig is giving you 30 days to either provide documentation of your actual financial backing or dissolve the partnership, Walter continued. He can't risk his reputation on a business relationship built on misrepresented credentials. Jake's face went white as he processed the professional consequences of his lies. Losing the partnership would mean starting over completely in his real estate career, possibly in a different market, where his reputation hadn't been damaged by the truth about his financial situation. But Walter wasn't finished with his revelations. He'd been in contact with Stephanie's family in Oregon, and the conversation had provided disturbing insights into Jake's pattern of deception within his marriage. Stephanie's sister told me something very troubling, Walter said. Jake has been borrowing money from Stephanie's parents for the past 6 months, claiming he needed short-term business loans to take advantage of investment opportunities. This meant that while I was paying Jake's mortgage, he'd been extracting additional money from his in-laws based on fabricated business needs. The web of financial deception was far more extensive than anyone had realized. Stephanie's parents have been supporting what they thought was Jake's expanding business, Walter continued. They've been proud of his success and happy to help their daughter's family prosper. Learning that Jake's entire financial narrative was false has been devastating for them. Patricia looked physically ill as she absorbed the scope of Jake's lies. How much money did you borrow from Stephanie's parents? Jake couldn't meet anyone's eyes. $15,000 over 6 months, but I was planning to pay it back once some deals closed. The pattern was clear. Jake had been managing his financial crisis by spreading deception across multiple relationships, taking money from me, while extracting additional funds from his in-laws, using each source of support to create false narratives with other people. Walter had saved his most important information for the end of the discussion. He'd been in contact with Emma's preschool teachers and other community members who'd observed our family dynamics at public events and school functions. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, has been concerned about Emma's behavior at family-related school events, Walter reported. Emma becomes withdrawn when other children talk about extended family activities, and she started asking questions about why some grandparents love their grandchildren differently. This observation hit me like a physical blow. I thought I was protecting Emma from the worst of the family dysfunction, but a trained educator had noticed signs that Emma was internalizing the rejection and trying to understand why she was treated differently than her cousins. Mrs. Rodriguez wanted me to tell you that Emma is a delightful, intelligent, emotionally healthy child. Walter continued, looking directly at me. But she's starting to absorb negative messages about her worth based on how some family members treat her compared to other children. Walter's documentation provided the perspective I'd been missing. As Emma's parent, I was too close to the situation to see all the ways she was being affected by the family dynamics. But outside observers had been noticing changes in her behavior and emotional responses that indicated the rejection was causing real harm. "I've made a decision about Thanksgiving," Walter announced, opening his final folder. "Emma and Bart will be spending the holiday with Margaret and me. We're going to start a new family tradition based on gratitude, honesty, and respect for each family member's dignity." This wasn't an invitation. It was Walter taking charge of family leadership to ensure that Emma experienced genuine welcome and celebration, rather than tolerance and conditional acceptance. "Patricia and Jake, you're welcome to join us if you're ready to treat Emma with the same love and respect you show Tyler and Trevor," Walter continued. "But there won't be any more gatherings where some grandchildren are celebrated while others are marginalized. The ultimatum was clear: change how you treat Emma, or lose access to family events that Walter would be organizing going forward." Given Walter's position as family patriarch and his financial influence, this represented a complete shift in family power dynamics. Patricia spoke for the first time in 20 minutes, her voice small and shaky. "I want to be part of Emma's life. I want to learn how to be a better grandmother to her." "That's going to require more than wanting," Walter replied. "It's going to require acknowledging the damage that's been done and taking concrete steps to rebuild trust. Emma needs to see consistent evidence that she's valued, not just hear promises that things will be different." Jake remained silent, apparently processing the professional and personal consequences cascading from his financial deception. His marriage was over, his business partnership was ending, his relationship with his children was complicated by Stephanie's departure. And now his place in the extended family was conditional on changing behavior patterns that had developed over years. Walter stood up slowly, using his cane to steady himself. "I'm going to give everyone some time to think about what kind of family relationships you want to build going forward. But I want to be clear about something: Emma's well-being is my top priority, and I won't tolerate any more situations where she's made to feel unwelcome or less important than other family members." As Walter gathered his documents and prepared to leave, he turned to me with the warmth I remembered from childhood visits to his house. "Bart, you've handled this situation with integrity and grace. Emma is lucky to have a father who protects her dignity and teaches her about genuine love through his actions." The conference room fell quiet after Walter left, with Margaret, Patricia, Jake, and me sitting around a table covered with evidence of decades of family dysfunction and the recent crisis that had forced everything into the open. Margaret broke the silence. "So what happens now?" For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had real choices about family relationships. Walter's intervention had shifted the power dynamic away from Patricia's favoritism and Jake's manipulation toward accountability and genuine care for the next generation. Now we decide whether we want to build something better, I said, looking at Patricia and Jake. But it has to be based on honesty and equal treatment for all the children involved. The old family patterns had finally been exposed and challenged by someone with enough authority and resources to enforce change. Whether Patricia and Jake would choose growth over comfort remained to be seen, but Emma would be protected and valued regardless of their decisions. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen on a Sunday morning teaching Emma how to crack eggs for pancakes, while sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a small backyard where we'd planted a vegetable garden together. The scene was ordinary and peaceful, but it represented the extraordinary changes that had transformed our lives since that devastating Thanksgiving text message. Walter had kept his promise about creating new family traditions. That Thanksgiving 6 months ago had been held at Margaret's house in Minneapolis, where Emma experienced being genuinely welcomed and celebrated for the first time in years. Walter had given a toast specifically thanking Emma for teaching the family about resilience and grace, and I'd watched my daughter beam with pride at being recognized as valuable rather than tolerated. The immediate aftermath of our family intervention had been difficult, but ultimately healing. Jake's business partnership had indeed dissolved, forcing him to start over in a different city where his reputation hadn't been damaged by the financial deception. He'd moved to Kansas City and found work with a construction company doing honest labor for honest pay while slowly rebuilding his character along with his career. The divorce from Stephanie had been finalized 3 months ago, but surprisingly, they'd worked out a custody arrangement that prioritized the twins' well-being over punishment or revenge. Stephanie had moved back to Oregon with the boys, and Jake visited them 1 weekend per month, paying child support from his construction wages and slowly rebuilding trust through consistent, honest behavior. Most surprisingly, Jake had called me 2 months ago to apologize genuinely for the first time in our adult relationship. He'd been attending counseling to address the shame and fear that had driven his deceptive behavior, and part of his healing process involved taking full responsibility for his choices. I spent so many years being terrified of disappointing Mom that I became someone who disappointed everyone. Jake had told me during that phone call, "You were the one person who actually helped me when everything fell apart, and I repaid that by allowing our family to treat you and Emma like problems to be managed." The apology had been meaningful because it acknowledged specific harm rather than offering vague regrets. Jake was learning to separate his fear of failure from his actual character, understanding that honest struggles were more valuable than dishonest success. Patricia's transformation had been even more dramatic. The intervention had forced her to confront not just her favoritism toward Jake, but the childhood experiences that had shaped her own parenting patterns. She'd begun therapy to address the generational damage that had been passed down through her family, working to break cycles of comparison and conditional love. The most visible change had been in how Patricia related to Emma. Instead of the polite tolerance that had characterized their previous interactions, Patricia now made genuine efforts to understand Emma's interests and personality. She'd started sending Emma books and puzzles through the mail with handwritten notes that showed real attention to what Emma had told her during their phone calls. Last month, Patricia had visited for Emma's 5th birthday party, and I'd watched my daughter experience having a grandmother who was genuinely delighted by her presence, rather than dutiful about including her. Patricia had spent hours playing Emma's favorite games and listening to her stories about preschool friends and playground adventures. The legal and financial consequences of the crisis had been resolved more smoothly than anyone expected. I'd formally ended the mortgage payment arrangement, and Walter had helped Jake negotiate a loan modification that made his house payments manageable on his construction salary. The goal wasn't to punish Jake for his deception, but to ensure his housing situation was based on his actual income rather than hidden family support. My relationship with Sarah had actually improved as well. When she saw how I'd protected Emma from family dysfunction, while working to create healthier relationships, she'd recognized that my documentation and intervention had been responsible parenting rather than dramatic manipulation. Our custody arrangement remained unchanged, but our co-parenting relationship became more collaborative and less adversarial. The most significant change had been in Emma herself. She'd blossomed over the past 6 months, developing confidence and security that came from knowing she was genuinely valued by the people in her life. Her preschool teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had commented on how much more outgoing and secure Emma had become, particularly in situations involving family discussions or extended family activities. "Daddy, Emma," said now carefully, placing eggshell pieces in the compost bowl while we made pancakes together. "Remember when everyone was upset about Thanksgiving and Uncle Jake was sad? I remember," I said, helping her whisk the batter. "That was a difficult time for our family. But now Uncle Jake has a new job and Grandma Patricia sends me books and Great-Grandpa Walter is coming to visit next month." Emma continued with 5-year-old logic that simplified complex adult dynamics into essential truths. Her ability to process the family changes without holding grudges or developing fear about relationships had been remarkable. Children are naturally resilient when they're protected and supported through difficult transitions, and Emma had absorbed the lesson that sometimes families need to change how they treat each other in order to be healthier and happier. The community response to our family crisis had provided unexpected sources of support and friendship. Several neighbors and parents from Emma's preschool had reached out with invitations and offers of help, creating a network of relationships that didn't depend on biological family connections. Emma now had multiple honorary grandparents and family friends who valued her for exactly who she was. My business had actually grown stronger during this period, partly because the emotional clarity from resolving family dysfunction had freed mental energy for creative and professional work. I'd landed 2 major consulting contracts and was considering expanding my services to include helping other small businesses navigate remote work transitions. But the most important lesson had been personal rather than professional. For years, I'd believed that love required accepting mistreatment in order to maintain relationships. I'd thought that protecting Emma meant shielding her from family conflicts while continuing to enable the dysfunctional dynamics that were harming her. Learning to set boundaries with family members had been the most difficult and most valuable growth of my adult life. I discovered that real love sometimes requires confronting harmful behavior rather than tolerating it, and that protecting Emma meant ensuring she grew up understanding her own worth rather than accepting whatever treatment others chose to give her. Walter's influence had been transformative for the entire family. At 84, he demonstrated that it's never too late to address family dysfunction and create healthier patterns for future generations. His willingness to use his authority and resources to protect Emma's emotional well-being had given all of us permission to prioritize genuine care over comfortable familiarity. The inheritance restructuring had been finalized 3 months ago, with most of Walter's estate now in trust funds that would support Emma's education and future opportunities directly. But more importantly, Walter had changed the family culture from one based on favoritism and manipulation to one based on accountability and authentic relationship. Margaret had become an unexpected source of ongoing support, visiting every few months and maintaining regular contact with Emma through video calls and letters. Having an adult family member who consistently demonstrated healthy relationship skills had been invaluable for both Emma and me. As Emma and I finished making pancakes together, I reflected on how much had changed since that devastating text message 6 months ago. The crisis that had felt like family destruction had actually been family reconstruction, forcing everyone to examine relationship patterns that had been harmful for years. Emma was now growing up understanding that she deserved to be treated with respect and kindness, that family relationships should be based on love rather than obligation. and that it's possible to change unhealthy dynamics when people are willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. The most profound lesson had been about the difference between enabling and supporting. My secret mortgage payments had enabled Jake's deception and Patricia's favoritism, while failing to address the underlying problems that were harming everyone involved. True support required honesty, boundaries, and accountability rather than silent sacrifice that allowed harmful patterns to continue. Looking at Emma as she carefully flipped her first pancake, concentrating intensely on getting it just right, I felt deep gratitude for the crisis that had forced our family to choose between dysfunction and growth. She was learning life skills in a kitchen where she felt valued and secure, building confidence from successfully completing tasks that mattered to people who genuinely cared about her development. The phone rang as we were setting the table for breakfast, and Emma ran to answer it with the enthusiasm of a child who expected good news from family phone calls. It was Patricia calling for their weekly conversation that had become a highlight of Emma's week. "Grandma Patricia," Emma exclaimed, "we're making pancakes, and Daddy let me flip them by myself. And I only broke one, and it's sunny outside, and I want to tell you about the butterfly I saw yesterday." I listened to Emma's excited chatter while finishing our breakfast preparation, marveling at how different these conversations were from the stilted, polite interactions that had characterized their relationship before the intervention. Patricia was learning to listen with genuine interest rather than dutiful patience, and Emma was responding with the natural affection and trust that children offer when they feel truly welcomed. After Emma finished her phone call, we sat down to eat pancakes together while planning our day. We were going to the farmer's market then, visiting the library, then working in our vegetable garden. Simple activities that had become precious because they were based on genuine choice and mutual enjoyment rather than obligation or conflict avoidance. "Daddy," Emma said between bites of pancake, "I'm glad our family learned how to be nicer to each other." Her simple statement captured the essence of what we'd accomplished over the past 6 months. We hadn't created perfect relationships or erased all the damage from years of dysfunction, but we'd learned how to treat each other with basic kindness and respect, and that foundation was strong enough to support genuine love and growth. As we finished breakfast and prepared for our day together, I felt profound gratitude for the painful crisis that had forced our family to choose between continuing harmful patterns and building something better. Emma was growing up understanding her own worth, surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was, learning that healthy relationships were possible even when they required difficult changes. The lesson I wanted to pass on to others facing similar family dysfunction was that protecting children sometimes requires confronting adults, that real love demands honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, and that it's possible to create healthy family dynamics at any point when people are willing to prioritize character over comfort. Emma deserved to grow up knowing she was valued and welcomed, and ensuring that environment had been worth every difficult conversation, every family confrontation, and every moment of uncertainty about whether relationships could survive honest communication about harmful behavior. 6 months after receiving that devastating Thanksgiving text, Emma and I were building a life based on authentic relationships, honest communication, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The family crisis that had threatened to destroy us had actually saved us by forcing everyone to choose what kind of people they wanted to be and what kind of legacy they wanted to create for future generations. Have you ever faced a situation where protecting someone you love required confronting family members who were causing harm? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is set boundaries that force people to choose between continuing hurtful behavior and building healthier relationships. I'd love to hear your thoughts about family dynamics and protecting children from emotional damage in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story about learning to prioritize my daughter's emotional well-being. over maintaining comfortable but harmful family relationships. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more real-life stories about family challenges and personal growth, and share it with anyone who might benefit from understanding that it's possible to change dysfunctional family patterns when we're willing to do the difficult work of honest communication and accountability. Remember that you deserve relationships based on genuine care and respect, and that protecting the people you love sometimes requires courage to address problems that everyone else wants to ignore. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the children who depend on you to create safe, loving environments where they can thrive.